Okay, everyone, welcome to the Environmental Performance Committee, 16th of May, Tuesday. Firstly up, we'll ask Brent to form a karakia. Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga, e mā kinakina ki uta, e mā taratara ki tai, e aki ana te atukura, e tio, e huka, e huhu, ti he Māori ora. Kia ora koutou. Thank you. And any apologies today? Apologies. We'll move on to confirmation of agenda. Can someone move, please? Thank you, Bruce.
Question first, please.
Sure.
I'd like a discussion on the terms of reference of this committee to be added. If we could have it, towards the end or whatever. I don't want to interrupt the flow of business, but I'd like a discussion about the terms of reference of the committee. Thank you.
Okay, seconder for the agenda. Thank you, Brian. Okay, that was it. And disclosures of interest. Any disclosures of interest? Okay, mover for that. That mover. Okay, thanks. Right, first up today we've got Chris Bredenbeck. Thank you, Chris. Patrick there as well. Maritime update, please. Thanks.
Good morning, all. So just before we start, Chris, so if for the councillors that haven't met Chris, our regional harbour master, thought just before Chris gets into his report, be an opportunity for Patrick to maybe introduce that part of our business. For those of you that may not have the familiarity with that part of our business, and then we'll hand over to Chris with his report. Over to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Brent. Good morning, everyone. So, Maritime Services, you'll hear from us mainly about environmental issues, and within our directorate, that's probably the lion's share of our work. So, Maritime Services, there's lots of different components to that. So, we're just taking the opportunity this morning to introduce you to a couple of key people in the team, and for Chris Bredenbeck, who is our regional harbour master, to sort of show you a bunch of roles and functions that essentially you can look at this as public safety. This is a public safety service that we're responsible for, and the challenges that come with that. So a couple of key people in the team would say Chris, our regional harbour master, and Lee Samphia, who dedicated man that he is he's on leave at the moment, but and Lee is our deputy. So Chris has prepared a bit of a show and tell, quite a few images, but we have tried to, it was interesting going through this with Chris, trying to rationalise what it is that we could get time to expose you to, but the reality is that there's a lot of different moving parts to the maritime side of things. So Chris is going to skip across the surface of those.
Thank you, Patrick. It's actually quite an easy subject to talk about because we've got lots of photographs of our work. We've got a pretty attractive sort of a region to be able to demonstrate. So how do we flick through this slide? Thank you. So I'll start with introducing our team. So myself and Lee Samphia and Hayden Coburn is also a deputy. So we're the leadership of our team. Hayden's based at Whitianga. Other members of the team on here, we've got Pam Copeland, who manages our office requirements. Donna Polmere looks after moorings for us, and Carl Walters is marketing and projects. So he looks after our outward facing communications like Facebook. And our operational team, we've got Chris Atkins. So he's just started with us. He's based here in Hamilton, along with Danique Cleven. And then over based on the coast, we've got Peter Marr and Stuart Lang. We've also got Barry King,
who is a casual employee. He's the busiest retired person I know, actually, but he does give us plenty of his time when he's available. So a big pile of numbers. The fact sheet, I suppose, details our region. So 1,138 k's of coastline, which is a huge area. The Waikato River, 415 k's, all the hydro lakes that sit on that. Maritime New Zealand do research on boaties in our region. They estimate 160,000 vessels are on our boats each year, which is an enormous area. It's a big conflict for space. It's very congested, and that has plenty of complexities. So we have 10 vessels in our team, which includes a couple of jet skis. So those are patrol vessels, they're work vessels, and they help us get the work completed. The facts on the right-hand side of this deals a bit about our patrolling capabilities, the work we do on the water that the public see. So that's the vessel stops, the formal interactions on the water, some of the compliance issues we have, 145 infringement notices for unsafe boaties this year, and somewhere between 600 and 1,000 on-water interactions every year that we get through as well. So in order to deliver the requirement over summer with the increased boating, we have Operation Neptune. It's in its 6th year. Operation Neptune is where we seek staff from the rest of council to come and support our small maritime team to be able to try and get out and really make a difference in boating safety in the busy waterways and holiday hotspots over the year. So this year, biggest year we have had for staffing. We got 22 staff from across the region who decided to come and work for us for a bit of time, which is marvellous, but logistically that's a pretty big deal as well. So we've got to accommodate the staff. We've got to be able to get them to the locations and get them out on the water. We've got to train them, which includes some skipper qualifications for the low-level vessels that we have, our smaller vessels. But it's a hugely popular thing. The staff really enjoy coming and working in a different space to what they normally do, and the public see us, and we have, I believe, really strong impacts on boating safety in the region through Operation Neptune. So it runs basically from Boxing Day for about 3 weeks, usually finishes on the Sunday about 3 weeks after that. We intend to stop about 1,000 vessels on the water every year, and when we don't have significant weather events, we do manage to get to that. So significant weather events. This year was unique, I think, for those people that recreate on the water. They would have been aware it's a pretty challenging time. So these are just a couple of images that, particularly after Cyclone Gabrielle, hail also really threw some curveballs at us. All of our navigation aids and channels were significantly affected, and that's a big workload in trying to reinstate those to keep our waterways safe. But you can see vessels stricken. We had 15 vessels come to grief over Cyclone Gabrielle alone. So those were vessels either breaking off moorings, washing up on beaches, sinking on their moorings. We lost 52 navigation aids, so that's buoys, chains, blocks across the region over 2 days.
In that early slide, you would have seen figures around aids to navigation, and Chris is going to expand on it more, but just also that understanding is that we're responsible for navigation aids for the region. So all of those channel markers, all the lights and buoys, they're ours, and they're ours to maintain, take care of, make sure they're in the right place. So that's another really large parcel of work that's within Chris's response.
Amusingly, I suppose, you see the 5 Knot Buoy parked outside a house there. That was Buffalo Beach Road in Whitianga. It went viral. It was a really popular piece because they thought we were managing speed on the roads of New Zealand as opposed to the water. So, but interesting that we can drive around in our vehicles picking up our navigation aids instead of our boats, which was significant.
Just a question
Sure.
about some of these vessels that, you know, end up tipping over and all. What happens to leakages of petroleum, whatever? Does that come under you guys or another group of people?
It does come under us. We're the initial response to those things. So one of the vessels you'll see around there, it was leaking a little bit of diesel, not substantial. So our initial assessment on these vessels is oil spill. So that's what we look at first, and whether we need to deploy our oil spill teams to actually deal with that, or whether we can manage the wreck in a way that it doesn't affect the environment. So that was just a little bit of sheen on the water, oil on top of the water. We've managed that with the sorbent booms and dealing with that before we try and recover the vessel or remove the vessel from the water.
And I think we've got some more detail actually on a little bit later.
Do. Sure.
But what about in our rivers and stuff like that, you know? Do you have something to, because a lot of the swimming places back up the Waikato River, there's a lot of boats that go into the pier of like Waipapa, Tutako, and you can smell the petrol in the water when you dive into it. You know? So you know, we've got this big thing about freshwater. So how does all of that get played into our trying to make freshwater? If you've got multiple recreation boats going into our rivers, and when we go to swim there, you know, you can smell the diesel in the water.
To your first, Katarana, the freshwater ways, that's us, and the lakes, waterways, East Coast Harbour, that's all us in our region, with the exception of Lake. So that is directly linked with ground. So the harbour master, that's like the department. That's an exception in our region. The rest of it is us. So there'd be two aspects there, Katarana. If it relates to vessel safety, like vessels and swimmers coming into contact in place, Chris's team. If it's more about contamination from a vessel, depend on the circumstances. These guys might get involved in containment and dealing with the immediate issue. But if it was about ongoing contamination into a water, that would actually sit with other teams. So yes, but us. Collectively, it's us.
So it's uncommon to have serious events. For example, there was one in Lake Taupo a little while back.
Uncommon. For the serious things, are you talking about the truck?
Yeah,
rollover
as an example.
Frequent than we'd like, you know. Those big events. Not to take away from Chris's, so the truck rollover, that's something like that might, yeah, that sort of, however, things happening in the maritime setting, like vessels that are, in fact, we've just had two examples of vessels going, issues with salvage and, you know, potentially with hydrocarbons in the water. That's 2 in a week, you know, so it's, rule of thumb's a little bit difficult.
Thanks, Chris.
So some of the other challenges around there, particularly that time of year, road closures. How do we get into the areas to actually be able to put these waterways right again? Communications. There were all sorts of challenges that presented with these severe weather events. And the workload that is to reinstate this and to get these boats out of the water is significant as well. So some real challenges for us around that. Some of the other business as usual that we have as well, on every boat ramp, 92 boat ramps in the region, there's signage. So we maintain the signs. There's moorings, over 800 moorings in our region, and each of those moorings has a resource consent and requirements for safety, which we monitor as well. Over 1,000 aids to navigation. So those are our buoys, our beacons, signage in the water, lights. So that's a big part of our ongoing day-to-day work, and then reinstating channels when there's been weather events. Trees come down, they grab our buoys, they drag them down the channels, and we go and follow those up again. So that's was a little bit more regular than we would have liked this summer, but also a big part of our job.
You have locator beacons or something or other on?
No, we have had some telemetry devices in the past, but they've been a little bit unsuccessful. So we just maintain a visual and monthly inspection, and we also have relationships with the commercial operator to let us know if there's any issues immediately. So we've got good systems. That we don't tend to lose them too often. They're normally a couple hundred meters where they should be, so we can recover reasonably quickly, which is good. Thank you. Next page.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Chris, how do we deal with derelict vessels? The moorings, etc.
Yeah, derelict vessels is a big challenging space for us. So we do have rules in our bylaw requiring the vessels to be operational, and also in the Maritime Transport Act gives us powers to deal with that. One of the challenges we have is the owners of those vessels are the people that have the requirement to meet those conditions, and often they're in that state because there has been no money to make those repairs. So we work quite hard with the community to try and get them to deal with the issue themselves, but at the end we do have to take the hard line, remove them, and then try and chase those funds from the owners. So we manage that as best we can, because each one $20,000 odd to remove a stricken vessel, and it's hard, but yeah, it's an ongoing issue. So.
And more for Stu.
Thanks, Chair. Just a supplementary question. I was reading that with interest, that Queenstown thing that's going on at the moment too. We can't put a lien on that if the owner of the vessel in question is a ratepayer. You still can't put a lien on their total costs incurred with picking up a vessel, I assume.
Just your mic there, Patrick.
Sorry. That would be very case specific, I think. That can often fails about removing applications. Ability to recover means this case is on. Yeah, but you'd look at it case by case. This team does. We need to incur those costs. Navigation safety issue. Owners see conditions now. Chasing the money.
We do have some legislative support around that, though. We are able to sell the vessel to recoup our costs. Often, though, the vessel value is far less than the recovery cost. So,
but if anyone's looking for a good backyard project, we've got a couple of good options here.
Good, thanks.
Indeed. So I've talked a bit about our on-water compliance side. This is our outward-facing education side. So there's some significant events we get involved with. Hutchwilko Boat Show, it's on this weekend. We are on a stand with Maritime New Zealand and with Auckland Harbour Masters. Between 20 and 30% of our boaties over summer come from Auckland. So it's a pretty important place for us to be and sort of raise that education. Some of the other things we have Anna Rose, who is in the bottom right there. She was representing Maritime at Tainui Games. We do Everyday Heroes, which is we join up with police and Coast Guard and things like that and sort of promote ourselves out in the public and boating safety, life jacket servicing, displays outside Smart Marine, etc. So those are some of the outward facing things we do as well. Next page, please. We're talking about marine oil spill before and wrecks. These are some of the issues that we face. The sheer size of those vessels. You can't get a picture of the size, but the one in the middle down there is a concrete hulled vessel. You know, even having the facilities in the Waikato to be able to pull a vessel that size and weight out of the water is difficult. But it does feature for us. So, yep, next page, please. Some of the other work we get involved with. We support the Police National Dive Squad. Unfortunately, with the Waikato River and our waterways, we do have a lot of fatalities from swimming in New Zealand, feature in the Waikato. So we support the police with getting them onto the water and helping them recover those bodies back to the loved ones. So that's an important role we take on, and we get involved with the other emergency services, close relationships with search and rescue and things, because we have the knowledge and the facilities to get them out into different regions. So we have joint training with Westpac there, part of a SAR search and rescue exercise. And interesting work. Another thing that features for us in a small way is shipping. We don't have a port in our region. We don't have a shipping port, but we do have a large number of vessels coming through our waters. So every black line there is a commercial vessel track, which you can see is outside Mercury Bay. So that's a big part that we just have to be aware of. We work with our harbour masters up and down the coast in managing some of that when it comes to an issue. Particularly recently, while they're hiding in our waters from storms off in the lee of Coromandel. So we had 30 vessels hiding there for a few days. So it's a pretty significant piece of work, but one that doesn't take a lot of our time. Next page. Marine oil spill. All of our maritime officers are marine oil spill trained. We are first call for most marine oil spills because we're there and we have the vessels. So these are some examples of recent training at Raglan and some of the work that we do in that space. Next page. This is an example of a small marine oil spill which we just dealt with from our own team. So a vessel submerged at Coromandel, we're able to mop up the small diesel spill, recover the vessel from the water, and get it out. So it's no longer a risk to navigation, nor is it a risk to the environment. So that's a small scale spill.
So, silly question, I guess. So where do you dispose of all of these blue pads when you finish and collect them, and where do you dispose of them?
So there are some landfills that can take that type of contaminated property. So yeah, imagine Rena, the thousands and thousands of kilos of contaminated property, but yeah.
So in the long run, from your perspective, then, what is the damage that's happening to the land through these things being thrown into the ground over multiple years? For instance, and this is hypothetical in itself, with the Healthy River Change Plan, we know it's 80 odd years before the leaching of some things get into the waterway. So what about these things? You know, we're cleaning up the river so it doesn't hurt the land, and yet we go and dump the stuff in the land. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
But
That's
how do we justify that?
I suppose at least with these, they're taking the best chance of being able to, you know, so, and of course, that's what a lot of management systems, country, we create a lot of waste. This is part of it, but it's far better that those hydrocarbons be taken out of that environment, based in a still facility, as opposed to allowed to stay in that kind of heading. Yeah, lesser of two evils.
Yeah. It's just fires, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, just one more thing. So some of the other issues that we have are emerging risks. Oiling, it's a new sport. There's plenty of new sports that seem to turn up every year, but this one is, people are operating vessels at speed that hadn't even been invented a week ago, it feels like, and they've got quite sharp foils under the water, and there's an example of somebody who's been collected by one of those. The other parts, on the right-hand side, you'll see a couple of significant issues with boats that are occurring. So when there's an incident like that, with that high risk, we also conduct initial investigations, and those investigations often will get referred on to the investigations team for a thorough, criminal consideration to prevent that type of activity in the future. So that boat being vertical at the top right, that's just a complete, bad decision, I suppose, where someone's gone too fast in conditions that they just shouldn't be in, and we have to do our best to try and prevent that type of activity. So next page, please. And another part of our business, we have 120 temporary maritime events every year in our region. So that's anything from paddleboard races through to high-speed power boats, and all of those require an uplift of our bylaw or a reservation of an area. So we do the audits of the safety assessments to ensure that those events aren't putting any people at risk.
You know, am I right, Chris? Those are all as a result of applications. So all of the people wanting to uplift the navigation safety bylaw to be able to run their event, they apply to Chris's office with a safety plan as for that to be considered, and then some of these are supported by us as well.
Yeah, occasionally we, for our more serious ones like Bridge to Bridge, we'll put boats on the water as safety vessels to support that event, just because of the high risk of it. The other events are more than able to be managed by themselves, and we might go and audit to ensure that they're meeting their what they say they're doing and keeping people safe. But it's significant in our region. We've got Lake Karakia, which has 48 events alone on that lake, and that's right in our back door. So it's a big part of recreating in our region.
So when someone applies, they need to have a plan as well, safety plan, at the same time. For example, that event on the top right there.
Yes. Yep. So that's our annual event. They supply all of the details, including an extensive safety plan and what vessels they're going to use for safety and how they're going to manage it, medical requirements.
So 12 months out.
About 3 months out. Most of our events in our region are annual, and they repeat. So they're sitting on a calendar, and if 3 months is ideal.
Okay.
On that picture, you've got logs side of the. Has it been a problem?
It has been significant this year, absolutely. That's the Waikato River, so the entire stretch of the river has logs and trees along the edges, and as the river comes off, you up, they get caught up on bridges, and they do cause us an issue. But more significantly for us this year, the impacts come in our harbours, where the logs have come through from tributaries, and they've been moorings and that type of thing. When they've been in the water a while, they're very difficult to manage. The sheer weight of them and inability to get them out is challenging. Where our capacity is overwhelmed, we use externals to. Yep. Finally, we have our marketing and projects person who, with Carl Walter, he's just started with us, but these are some of the projects that we get involved in as well. So these are online videos, some of them in collaboration with other regional councils, where we try and draw attention to some of our particular issues like communications and life jackets and skiing with observers, and some of our high risk issues that we've got in our region. We do this on a bit of a low budget. You'll see the swimmer there might look familiar, pulling on his goggles. So I'm not only the harbour master, I'm also an actor, it would seem, from time to time. But it's a really successful way that we educate the public as best we can around some of the things that'll keep them safe. So it's an ongoing piece of work for us, and it's something that's pretty interesting as well. So
you'll see that there's many and varied aspects to maritime things, and so I've picked up maritime team opportunity to get up. I have to say that there's a real team. I'm going to emphasize a really small team that have got a heck of a large region, very, very good. And so, yeah, if I was able to indicate around levels of service that we're currently providing, I think we have got a wee go in respect of getting that safety aspect to a more substantial, that was part of wanting.
Thanks. Warren?
Yeah, Patrick, and my question is around that. How are we going with recruitment, and what are we looking like in that space? You know?
So I think first time in quite some time, we actually don't have any vacancies, which is great. So so the team that we've got allocated are fully allocated. They're getting trained, being brought up to speed, learning the council way, these sorts of operational. Way better position than where we were just before Christmas, where when you've only got 4 maritime officers and 2 of them resign immediately before Christmas, that puts the team under real pressure. Particularly, Chris has talked about Neptune, where we have one of our permanent maritime officers. We have sort of exponential coverage because we get all of these other people, council people, being supported by them. So we lose 2 people. In some respects, it was a good thing, safety-wise, at a cyclone. People on big summer when everyone's out. It's stretched. I gave a hand myself a couple of years ago, and coverage, say out of Whitianga for an 8-hour period. Guys will knock off at 6 o'clock in the evening. Suddenly, there's something happening at Cook Beach still at 7 o'clock in the evening. And that's just one little portion of the cover. So it's these events that are happening. May be aware that with the eruption in Tonga last year, that caused a relatively tsunami here, that actually picked up our channel markers, 2 of our harbours, and shifted them. So suddenly we've got our road markers aren't on the road anymore, and guys have had to go out on no notice and replace. So there's all these little things, and they're happening. Gabriel, it feels like a very big event, bit of a one-off, but I'm not sure how one-off these really are. Well, also that I think Gabriel cost us in chains and markers just on the so that's we'll be able to have stock available to immediately be able to go out and replace those, because as soon as the weather's clear, people are back on the water and they've got to have those safe and navigable water. So it's challenging. It's challenging.
So the indication probably is more money, not more staff.
No, I think it's well, definitely like the cost of running vessels.
Being recorded, eh?
Yeah, cost of running vessels is clearly more than it used to be. The reality is we can't currently keep up with maintenance current budgets, and so we have to look elsewhere within other budgets. But the reality also is so that's reality also that you need people on the ground. And so people are absolutely part of the lifting the level of service. Absolutely.
Thanks, Stu.
Thank you, Chris and Lee for coming in. So Patrick. Just, I guess, personally, and maybe on behalf of the committee as well, just want to acknowledge Chris and Lee. This period, just the same way that our flood teams have been working like crazy through the period of these weather events. Our maritime team have equally been working crazy. One of those big vessels you saw earlier, 100-ton, 20-metre long vessel was floating around the harbour, causing all sorts of risks, and our Deputy Harbour Master in Whitianga was out there till 3 o'clock in the morning, making sure that that was secure to keep the community safe over there. Small team that you'll see has an incredibly wide portfolio of work that they do, use the entire spectrum of tools that they're at their disposal through education, through promotion. Many of you will have seen that to ensure we have really good communication with our boating community, we have a specific Facebook page for the Harbour Master to ensure that we have that direct communication with those that are using our waterways. They do a great job, and over the last few months it's been an incredible amount of hours for a lot of people, and just as we have done with our flood team. So just wanted to formally acknowledge the work that you guys do.
Thank you, Brent.
Yes, thanks, Brent. Thank you, guys. Okay, we've got to, what's that? Yep. Okay, so Catarina will move that we receive the report. Seconded by Bruce. Thanks, Bruce. All right, next up we've got. So do we, everyone, you will put that all in favour? Yep. Opposed? Carried. Thanks. Okay, next up we've got freshwater farm plans. Tracy, welcome. Going to update us on that.
If I can just introduce this. So recall at the beginning of this training we acknowledged that freshwater farm plans is going to be a significant issue for our rural community over the next 3 years and beyond, and so that we would make sure that we come back to you every EPC to give you an update of what's been going on over the past few months and a little bit of what's might be coming over the next few months. So Tracy's here to give you the second update in the series, and so what you'll hopefully be able to do over the course of the triennium is just see these quarterly updates, giving you hopefully good confidence about what's been planned to be delivered on what is a pretty significant piece of obligation on our rural community. It's our rural community are the ones that are subject to these regulations that are coming through, and so Tracy's here today to give you the latest update. Over to you, Trace.
Kia ora, nice to see you. I will take my report as read, and if you have any questions, could you save them to the end, because hopefully I might cover some things during the presentation. Next slide, please. So the purpose of my presentation today is just to give you a bit of an update of where we're at, because we put a proposed freshwater farm plan rollout to the Minister for the Environment for approval. So I want to share with you. I do want to make it very clear though that it is only our recommendation and it hasn't been approved yet. Next slide, please. So just some background. As you know, PC1 is still going on, and during that time, freshwater farm plans were introduced. This is going to involve approximately 9,000 landowners in our region who will need a freshwater farm plan. While we haven't seen the freshwater farm plan regulations, we know some things, and what we know is in the draft, it said that when the regs are turned on, a landowner would have 12 months from when it was turned on to submit a farm plan. We know that we're one of the first regions to be turned on, along with Southland. Gisborne now, because of the cyclone, has been delayed. But given these large numbers of dairy farms, not just dairy farms, also horticulture, sheep and beef, that a phased rollout is going to be really important for successful implementation. Next slide, please. So we were given the opportunity to come up with our phased rollout that needed to be over a 3.5-year period. And so we got together a big group of people and thought about what do we need to consider when we're thinking about our rollout. I guess one of the big things that was on our mind is that we want landowners to succeed. We want to make it as easy as possible for them, while also balancing the desired environmental outcomes that the community want. So some of the things we were thinking about is the time frame for PC1, farmers that had intensive winter grazing as part of their farming practice. In the regulations, farmers that had intensive winter grazing can either address the regulations in a freshwater farm plan or they need to get a consent. And we made the decision that actually we want as many farmers as possible to be able to have the freshwater farm plan as an option. It will cost them less. It gives them more control. Also, like I said before, 9,000 farmers. You have to have support for farmers to be able to meet the regulations. We have to have trained certifiers and auditors and farm developers. So when we were considering our rollout, we considered the numbers of farmers throughout the region. Also, we actually want people to be certifiers and auditors, and so we didn't want a system where they might be really busy one year and then there's a bit of a lull in future years. And also, we really wanted to consider where in the region we needed to focus our attention. Next slide, please. Now, we haven't seen the regulations, the finalised regulations. PC1 is still going through mediation, so we had to make some assumptions, which isn't always fun. But what we have assumed is that PC1 will not be operative by the 1st of July 2023. That for PC1 permitted activities, it's not going to be 6 months, it's going to be 12 months. That the freshwater farm plan regulations must be turned on no later than the end of 2025. And that once a farmer submits a farm plan, instead of having 12 months to submit it to a certifier, they have 18 months.
So just a question then, what's the difference between the PC1 and the freshwater one? Are they going to be compatible, or do a farmer has to have two?
We are trying our very best, and that comes a bit later in the slides, to align them. And that's through the appeal process and evidence we're giving in Environment Court. But Brent, is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
It's absolutely the right question to ask, Councillor. And so over the past, ever since the regulations were proposed by the Crown, this council's submission to the Crown was, please make sure that these things are aligned. And through the court appeal process, this council, through one of my staff, is presenting evidence to the court on what we know about the two instruments, equally imploring the court to do whatever it can to ensure that the two are aligned for the very purpose that you've just described of an endpoint that a rural landowner doesn't need to have two different documents. One document will meet the obligations of both PC1 and the regulations. So that's definitely the right question and definitely the intent. So hopefully that's how it ends up.
Thank you. Next slide. So what we have recommended is splitting the region into 8 sub-regions. So that's the first region will be turned on the 1st of July 2023. That's if the rules get gazetted. And again, we don't know. This hasn't been finalised. And the last tranche will be turned on in July 2025. You'll see, and I have another slide with it's more visual, that we're turning on the PC1 areas first. And we're trying to align it to PC1 because we don't want farmers to have 2 farm plans. So it really is playing on our mind, and it is something that is definitely important.
Tracy, just who, in regard to who qualifies or who's required to get the farm plans, for example, if a property owner has 5 hectares, 7 hectares of agricultural type land, but doesn't engage in farming, are they required to have a plan?
So the best of my knowledge, if you are 5 hectares or more and you are horticulture, you have to have one. If you are a combination of pastoral and horticulture, you have to.
Yes, 20 hectares and over for
Yep.
farming, etc.
Yep.
But if you own that land and are not engaged in farming,
Yes, you
if
still
it's
have
just
Yes.
sitting there, you're
Yes,
still
you still have
required.
to have one.
I think the regulations haven't been gazetted yet, and so the final state of the regulations is not clear yet. But it's regulations for using a land for a certain purpose. We're expecting them to be regulations that talk about using the land for a purpose. And so if they're using the land for the purpose of horticulture or dairying or dry stock, I'm not expecting barren land to require a farm plan. And if the regulations are written that way when they come out, that would be somewhat unexpected because it's about using of the land for a purpose. But we're waiting. Current wording on the street is that the regulations they expect will be gazetted in early June. Current word on the street, if that's the right way to put it, is that the regulations will be turned on in this region by order of council in August. But all of those things are for government to determine, but that's where we're proceeding with our planning on that basis because you have to plan on some basis, and so that's what our current understanding is.
Yep, Stu.
But further to Clyde, where I think Clyde's going, if you've got 25 hectares and you're just selling standing grass, the farm plan's going to be pretty basic, isn't it? Providing you don't deviate from those couple of basic things you're doing with the land.
So it's, Councillor, if a little bit what they're using the land for, if it's not being used for dairying, it's not being used for horticulture, it's not being used for dry stock, it's not being used for those various things. So the regulations will have what the various uses of the land need, which trigger the need for a farm plan. So hasn't been gazetted, but using land for not using for one of those purposes that they identified, then it won't trigger the need for a farm plan.
Yeah, so where I'm going though is that the complexity of the farm plan triggered by the questions one.
Assume, and when the regulations get gazetted, we'll all know, yeah.
Just a question on the cost. Obviously, there's a range of it. Assuming you're doing dairying, do we
idea of what a farm plan would be?
So the dairy sector is very well supported by the dairy companies, and we are in discussions with the dairy companies around how they're going to incorporate it into their existing plans, and whether there will be a cost to that or not will be up to them. But at this stage, we do not know what the will be.
There's some sectors like horticulture. Where will the cost lie?
Farmer.
Councillor, so the way that the regulations are written, all costs are lying with the landowner. So that'll be costs of preparing the plan, and some sectors will be providing support for farmers to prepare the plan. Then the plan needs to be submitted to a party by a certifier, and the certifier is a party, and the landowner needs to pay the certifier, and the certifier will effectively give the tick to say that the plan meets the obligations that are set out in the regulations, and then subsequently there's an obligation that we know is going to be in the regulations because it's been in the draft, that landowner will need to have their farm plan audited, and then the landowner will pay the auditor, and the auditor is to check that the obligations that are set out in the farm. So those are costs that will all go through to the way the regulations are written, goes through to the landowner.
Robbie, where does ICM sit with this, with the largest areas of leasing land? Because end up charging the leasee for that cost, or we're going to have to absorb that ourselves in council?
So that's a conversation that no doubt will happen within our ICM directorate, with the chair of that committee, Councillor Cookson, I imagine. But yeah, those obligations will sit with the operator, and so I guess that's a conversation that Tracy's team are most certainly keeping our ICM colleagues informed about what we know about the regulations, so that they can plan and prepare what might be relevant for be a part of the business as it relates to being a landowner. Yeah.
Yeah, we've started having those conversations.
Because there's a lot of them that would be way less than the 20 hectares, or may even only be a hectare in one place. You've got to go through all that huge amount of cost if it's connected to a dairy farm. It's still going to be the same cost if it was 100 hectares, I imagine.
Right, moving on.
So you will see that we've got a second equal, the West Coast South area is getting turned on early next year, and that's because of intensive winter grazing. There is a lot of intensive winter grazing there, and as I mentioned previously, we want farmers to be able to have the opportunity to meet their regulations through a freshwater farm plan. I wanted to give you some numbers on the farms per tranche. So PC1, Waipa, we think there's about 1,800. Mid and Upper Waikato, about 1,800. The West Coast South, it's a small catchment, about 350 people. Lower Waikato is again 1,800. Hauraki is 2,200. Now, we thought about where we were going to put that catchment, and we decided to moved it up because of the water quality issues, and we want to address them. And then the last three, they're relatively small. Combined, it is only 1,150 farms, predominantly dry stock. We know the dry stock sector may not be as exposed to farm plans as the dairy sector. We also know that PC1 farmers, they've generally been exposed to farm plans because PC1 has been around for a very long time. Next slide, please. So, I've mentioned most of the rationale for our recommendation. The other thing I wanted to cover was we know that the sector is going to play a big part in this and supporting farmers. And so we wanted to have a rollout which also helped them with scale. If we turned on all the farms, all the regions, and we're asking the dairy NZs, the beef and lambs, the Fonterras to come and support us, to get engagement, communication, awareness out there, that's a big ask. So that was one of our considerations as well. The region is really lucky to have primary organisations that are really keen to work together for the greater good and to support farmers. As I mentioned in my last update, we had an event in Karakia and it went great, and we had a lot of diverse groups there, all wanting the same thing. They all want a consistent message to farmers, and they all want to know what's coming up so we can work together, because we don't want to double up on things. And so I think we're really lucky, and the landowners are really lucky to have that. Next slide, please. So I've shared our proposed rollout, but what are we doing to support farmers to successfully meet their obligations? So we are developing a farm plan engagement strategy. Now, I will share this once the freshwater farm plan rules have been gazetted with you. And again, this is about how can we work with externals to make sure that we're reaching those landowners that need it based on the rollout, but also groups of farmers that maybe haven't had as much experience with farm planning as others. The work program is really, really varied because under the regulations, we need to provide regionally endorsed certifier and auditor training. So there is a national accreditation body that we are working closely with, but for a certifier and an auditor to work in a specific region, they have to do regional training. Under PC1, we have to have a farm registration tool. So although there is going to be a national platform for freshwater farm plans, we're talking to them to see if it's going to meet our requirements for PC1 and if it's going to be available on time.
It's just a double up of work. Considering we did all of this at PC1, we as Waikato Regional Council plus Fonterra and those other dairy places, we got together to help farmers look at a plan change, this environmental plan. And now you're saying that we're going to try and help them to do this new one. So once again, where in our view of Waikato Regional Council, do we combine all of what we've done so that we are looking at one page? Because I know we put a lot of work into those farm environmental plans after for PC1. We went up and down the goddamn country, within Waikato, working with farmers, working with Fonterra. You're doing it again. So it's not about inventing the wheel. It's about taking what was good out of one and trying to amalgamate it, cut down the load of what we have to do. Are we looking at all of that?
Katarina, I think when Tracy was talking about the policy program, I think she described limitation as the one form of flattery, isn't it? So fundamentally, the regulations that the government is putting in place is very similar to PC1. They've seen the PC1 move towards farm planning, and a lot of it is a mirror of that. Unfortunately, sometimes when these things go through, there's little differences, but sometimes little differences can become challenging for implementation. So things like timing, you don't want to go, you want to go to a rural landowner once, not once today and again in 12 months' time, which is why you'll see the proposed rollout that was said to the minister is we want the timing for when these things go live in the PC1 area to be consistent for when freshwater farm plans under PC1 would have gone live, so farmers can just engage the once and it meets the obligation of both PC1 and the regulations. So that's part of the background to our suggestion to the minister about timing so that those things align. The National Farm Plan database here, you'll recall that this council PC1 requires a digital platform around farm plans to be submitted. This is a national digital platform. And so the opportunity here is for us to work with the entirety of the country around a digital platform, which will meet our needs rather than having to fund and pay for our own digital platform. So there's opportunities there around doing things at a collective level, which would have savings for our ratepayers by not having to have our own digital platform. The challenge that we have is, and it's a challenge that we're working closely with government on, is ensuring that digital platform is in place in time to deliver on the needs of PC1. Because what we do not want to have to do is to develop something for PC1, but then there's something that comes along which is nationally 18 months later, because then you pay twice. And so we're very active in that space. And one of the things that's happening right now is we're talking about a thing called a bridge, which is just euphemistically if there is a timing issue between when the national system will be in place and when our needs under PC1 are, what would bridge that requirement until the national system's in place. So you can be sure that we are very actively trying to make sure that things are aligned, and there's lots of little elements to this, but they're all about making sure that that nothing happens which undermines the work that was done to deliver PC1 for this region. Okay, moving on, Tracy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And iwi engagement under the freshwater farm plan regs, iwi are provided an opportunity to help with the regionally endorsed training, to help support, appoint certifiers and auditors, and also to help develop catchment context challenges and values, which is called CCCV. But we know this comes at a time when iwi are under a lot of pressure and have a lot of competing demands. And so our plan is to work with our iwi partners to identify what role they would like to play and what can they actually have the time for at the moment. And that's my talk. Thank you. Questions?
Good. Thanks, Tracy. Any further questions? Yep, Stu.
Thanks, Tracy. Really agree with the timing stuff. Catchment. Just a question around, I mean, the intensive winter grazing rules have arrived here because too many farmers aren't playing the game.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to have changed much in the last couple of years. And Rollo, I'm really supportive of using the farm planning process to get around the need for individual specific resource consents. It does worry me that if we're not adequately resourced to follow up and audit those farm plans in a timely manner, I find that, you know, there's been some pretty inappropriate grazing going on, and to be honest, the Waipawa and West Coast biggest impediment. Yeah. So just curious as to around that, is resourcing, having the resourcing to do some follow-up, sure that those are being completed.
So when a landowner submits their plan to be certified, they then within 12 months, it will get audited. And what we are doing is we are working with the rural professionals to try and get as many people certified to become certifiers and auditors as possible, trying to understand what they need, what are some of the barriers, what are they thinking around it, and so there will be enough people for that, because you're right.
So, Councillor, it's again, absolutely the right question, and we are going through the process as we come through to the LTP now to look and say, well, what do we think is the appropriate level of resourcing for the sort of oversight of the responsibilities that are coming through in the freshwater farm plan. And as you would expect, whenever there's new regulation, the first thing that you're doing is educating, supporting, giving people the right information to make good decisions. And then you have an escalation process for when things aren't happening the way that they should happen. And that will be that'll be pretty clear when we come forward as part of the LTP to talk about what we
Yeah.
see as the best way to encourage, support, and then direct people over time to ensure that we have good quality farm plans that are in place, achieving the outcomes. So it's an element of it, but the key thing that we're in the first instance is engaging people, engaging our partners to help support the rural community to be able to get these farm plans in place.
Yeah. I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's really no different to, we're actually going to have to be, early or however to see whether or not some of them, I think I've got the plan now, it's all good to go, but for understanding of what it.
Okay, thanks, Tracy.
Thank you.
Right, can we have someone move, please, that we receive a freshwater farm plan report? Katarina? Yep, seconded. Robbie? Thank you. And all in favour? Opposed? Carried. Thanks very much. Right, regional consents update. Hi, Amy. Welcome.
Morena koutou. As always, I have a pretty brief report, so I figure that I'll just take it as read, and if any of you have any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them for you.
It's on page 3, I guess that's what my page says. Allocation. It says water take applications lodged since February was 22, and decisions made since then was 26. So I'm presuming that you've had a lot of take allocations that you haven't did it yet. So how many of those 22 are in that 26?
Can't answer that question, but I can tell you
Kapakina.
that we do have a big backlog still.
Oh, right,
But we've employed someone on a fixed term contract for 18 months to try and get through that backlog. So her role specifically is just to get through it and get them all signed off. So my understanding is she's making pretty good headway, but she's only been with us for about not even 3 months.
This water take looks like more Waikato River. But what about the other rivers, you know, like Piako, Waiho, those rivers that's got especially Mangatu or Punu, who's got really large farms butting onto those rivers. Do we have any allocation of water memory around them that might be new or not?
My understanding was that there were some allocation issues around the Piako, but I'm not
All right.
across the other river catchments. Brent, you might know.
It's just that in the summertime, I see those, in the wintertime, I see some of those farmers up our way using the water allocation to water the land that's already wet. And I wondered the reason for that maybe is because they're trying to get allocation. So hence the question, especially up the Mangatutu.
If you want, I can add other catchments to this report into the future. If that would be, we can happily do that if that's something that you would find helpful.
Thank you.
Anything further, Amy? Oh, sorry. Bruce,
If there's questions.
Yeah, through the chair. Obviously, we've been reading in the newspapers about Gleason's Quarry. I just wondered if you could just a little bit more background, because I've been asked quite a few questions about people, and in particular, I believe the case that the staff didn't application and the commissioners went ahead and did support it. Is that the case?
That's correct. So the staff recommendation was to grant. I know that there were other staff. We had a more senior staff member mentoring the person that wrote the Section 42A report who didn't necessarily agree. So it was a little bit fraught internally, I suppose, as to where that recommendation should lie. But the reporting officer felt quite comfortable that was the right recommendation to make. Then subsequently, when it went through the process, the commissioners decided to, she to decline. The commissioners decided to grant, and so that's now been appealed by the local marae on matters of incorporating mataranga Māori into the conditions, and also incorporating like an iwi liaison group type forum into the conditions as well.
If I can just add a couple of points to that, Bruce. So, yes, so both the district council and the regional council reporting officers, based on the information that was in front of them at the time, felt that the balance better fell in terms of delivering on the purpose of the Act for the decline rather than grant. That's not uncommon where things are quite on a balance for the officers when they're going into a hearing to say on balance here. It's not unusual then when an applicant turns up to a hearing and they see that other things get brought to the table, and commissioners then listen to the other things that are brought to the table and find a view that with those things on the table, if that's the right way to place it, they believe that there are conditions that can be put in place where the balance would move the other direction. So in this situation, the commissioners felt that having heard the evidence and heard, it's a term I've heard judges use on more than one occasion, what are you putting on the table? Sufficient was put on the table for the commissioners to believe that it was appropriate to grant. But as you'll see, as Amy identified, it's being appealed. My understanding is that the appeal parties will get together, and sometimes what happens with that is things get put onto the table and things get resolved, but we'll leave that to the appeal process to work it through. So it's not uncommon. In fact, I've been in the situation myself personally where I have recommended something be declined, and then been quite happy with the commissioner's decision to grant because a whole lot more got put onto the table through the course of the hearing than was there before. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, and just if I could just a little bit. So I mean, it's essentially material being bought from outside the region to be dumped within the Waikato region.
So my understanding is that that's likely to be the case, but the matters that are relevant for the consent that's sought is not where the material comes from, it's the effects of the placement of that material in this location. It's not so that the decision maker is bound by the matters that are relevant to the decision. But I do understand that you're right that material would be predominantly coming from.
And just one last one, sorry. And so the material that is being dumped, I mean, what are the other options for that material? I mean, is there no other solution than to put it in a landfill?
So you're starting to get into some details that will be not details that either Amy or I would have, but where, so I'll take you back to what the legislation requires. The legislation requires the decision makers where there's likely to be an effect of significance to consider alternatives. So if alternative options, and so that would have been a matter that would have been addressed through the hearing process if the commissioners considered that there were effects of some significance, then the Act requires you to start going down that pathway. So Amy can provide you with a copy of the decision. I'm not aware whether that's a matter that they.
Thank you.
Yep, the same thing.
So
says it's been they both joined forces decision to decline, or are they on either?
So yeah, late last week, I've been in the Environment Court for days. So there's quite a story behind what's happened at Te here. When it was first developed, it was owned by HG Leach, and they went through the consent process, and Ngāti Hako, they say that the maunga that is being mined essentially is their tupuna maunga, so their ancestral maunga, and they appealed that process, but the consent still got granted. Then a bit down in the track, HG Leach decided to extend it again, and Ngāti Hako appealed again, and they reached an out-of-court settlement, which is essentially an MOU to say that there would be no further expansions if this one went ahead. So Ngāti Hako signed off that faith. Then HG Leach sold to Waste Management New Zealand, who said that that MOU is not with us, it's with HG Leach, and they have since to expand it again. And so Ngāti Hako is appealing, saying this isn't what we agreed, it's not what we wanted. So we're sort of halfway probably through the Environment Court process at the moment. The first 3 days was taken up entirely by the applicants. It's going, but Hauraki District Council is certainly looking for a decline as well. And sort of linking over to Councillor Clarkson's question is that there isn't actually a lot of landfill space available. So the judge in this case will be thinking about the effects, obviously the cultural effects on Ngāti Hako, but also quite likely this landfill will fill up in the next few years, as will Hampton Downs, and there won't be any, no one seems to be looking for the next available spot for original landfill. So landfilling is a big issue at the moment. But I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does.
Oh, okay, yep.
If I can just, often what happens is that, that appeals are lodged because you need to be in the game to be in front of the court, to have your views heard. So, because if you're not there, it's very hard for court to be able to cross-examine and to adduce evidence. And so often you'll see this sort of thing where you think, well, why are parties there? Because both parties very keenly want to have their case heard.
Thanks. Warren?
Yeah, just really quickly, Amy, the Buffalo Beach, are we in approval with the points that have gone back?
Where we're at the moment, essentially almost everything has been resolved. We're just seeking an external legal opinion on a covenant. So one of the conditions that was imposed was to place a bond on the property owners. So if any of them ever left, or if they all decided to just walk away, then there'd be enough money held by Waikato Regional Council to remediate whatever needs to be done, fix it up. They aren't happy with that, and so we're looking at what a covenant option might look like. So we're almost there in terms of settling. It's just agreeing on what that looks like. So.
And does the piece of TCDC owned land beside it, obviously with the boat club, is that any effect on this process at all? At the outside?
That's separate. That's completely separate. That land is being impacted by that seawall, but TCDC have said to us that they have an interest in extending the structure to protect that piece.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Anything further?
No, not from me.
Any other questions? Sure, Brent's just going to finalise.
Amy skipped over it quite quickly, but I just wanted to reinforce something that Amy's team have been doing, and that's in relation to water allocation through the Waikato Waipa catchment. Many of the councillors will know that for a long period of time there was a queue needing to access water from the Waikato Waipa catchment because we had a lot more water sought than we had water available to allocate. What that created is because you can't, with the first in, first serve requirement, you had to deal with the first one and then you get on. And so that meant that the queue just get created. So a lot of really good work from Amy's team, working with current holders of consents and new proponents for consent, making sure that their pencils were sharpened really well, has meant that we're in a position now where we have more water to allocate than we have water sought, which is good. It means that the Waikato catchment isn't going to be over allocated, and that can change. The number there, which says 1.38 cubic metres per second at the mouth, looks like a small number there. It's a much bigger number when you turn it into the numbers that we normally, which is cubic metres per day. So that's a cubic is an awful lot of water. Yes, and one of my science colleagues will tell me if my maths is really bad, but it's probably over 100,000 cubic metres a day in the more water to allocate now than we have. So that's a really, really great piece of work that Amy and her team done, and also a really good reflection on those in the community who have been seeking water, saying, no, we have an obligation to make sure we sharpen our pencil. They've sharpened their pencil, and the money has come, the water has come back into the system. So that's a really good reflection of of people out there, taking a really good look at their water needs. What it does mean, though, is that queue, whilst it's not a queue in a legal sense anymore, we still have hundreds that were there, and we're ploughing through them as quickly as we can. But Amy and the team, a lot of them are for people who are replacing an existing consent. So it's not like they're waiting to get their water, I don't want to undermine the consent process, but the paperwork that needs to get done around that, where Amy has new people come in who say, I need this water now for a business purpose. She picks those up and prioritizes them. So we have people who have a need. We're it's a very customer focused around where people's needs are, whilst those who are looking to get their consents replaced are continuing under their old consent whilst the new one is dealt with. So team's working really hard, and Amy will keep us informed about how we're just getting that backlog out of the way. Did I cover that, Amy?
So one more last question, Amy, because of what Brent has just said around these the deferral waiting lists. Now, I know for a fact that local councils have a consent out there waiting, and they won't go and get that water until they think they need it. With the growth pattern that's happening within the Waikato, I'm going to presume that a lot of these local councils have water consent allocations going out into that deferral that makes that 100 a lot more than it's worth. Where do we start looking at those projected allocation points, especially because one of them was that big farm place up in Taupo that they ended up giving some to somebody else. One was Waipa District Council. They had a huge allocation that they didn't actually tap into until about 3 years ago, because their waterways up at the Rongia dried out. So, where does this?
So it sounds like it's a topic of some interest for the committee, and so we can work together on a paper to bring back to you. But just a couple of examples. Waipa District Council went through a consolidation process through a number of their consents a number of years ago, which resulted in them being able to release water back into the system. Taupo District Council had multiple consents around Lake Taupo. They identified that the collective amount of water that they had allocated for multiple areas was more water than they needed, and so went through and reviewed, and they put water back into the system. And so people across the board, the work that in particular people like Bevan and the science team do around providing information around actual use through the telemetry data that comes in and need, are then able to then rationalise. And so it's a pretty common thing now with that data to be able to make good decisions about water use. But I see Amy's writing down, and we can talk about what sort of a paper might come to another committee about giving you greater confidence about what's happening in that allocation space.
Yep, great. Thanks for that, Amy.
Just on that.
Yes, last one.
Well, I just note here, we've got our report.
So it's the planning process through which the council identifies what water is available for allocation. Then the consenting team operates within that. So if there's science information that suggests a change to what should be allocated, it goes through your planning process, and then the regulatory team implement it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All righty. Thanks, Amy. You're dismissed. Right. Okie dokie. Can we have a mover, please, to receive the report? Thank you, Ben. Seconder. Thank you, Bruce. All in favour? Opposed? Carried. Thanks. All right. Look, we've got, what have we got? Peat Soils Investigation Progress Report. And that's Justin and Alice. Thank you. And we'll take a 10-minute break after this presentation. All right. Welcome, guys. Go right ahead.
I'm just gonna, oh, there we go. Yeah, can I just try and share my screen? Okay. Okay, so good morning, councillors. My name is Justin Wyatt, and I'm a soil and land scientist here at Waikato Regional Council. This morning, my colleague and I, Alice Wheatley-Wilson, will be talking to you about some work we've been doing to better understand the peatlands in the Waikato region and their management. So this morning, our presentation will just give you a bit of a background of the peatlands in our region, some of the issues associated with drainage and their management, some policy associated with their use, and some work we've been doing in this space in the last couple of years. So as a background, there are about 84,000 hectares of peatlands in the Waikato region. And so as you'll see on the map on the right here, the majority of peatlands is shown as the bright green areas. So these peatlands were formed in a wetland where a high water table prevented the breakdown of organic matter, allowing thick layers of peat to form. Across our region, peat depth is variable, but it can be up to 14 metres deep in some places. An example is Kapuatai wetland on the Haraki Plains. Over the last 100 years or so, at least 80% of our region's peatlands have been drained, mostly for pastoral agriculture. And again, on the image on the right there, those areas in the burgundy colour are our remaining freshwater wetlands. And the areas in bright green are those areas that have been converted to pastoral agriculture. So those remaining freshwater wetlands are unique, both locally, nationally, and in some cases internationally. However, we also need to remember that drained peatlands also contribute to our regional economy. Unfortunately though, drainage leads to subsidence of the land and greenhouse gas emissions. So here I just want to quickly give you a comparison between an intact peatland and a drained peatland. So on the left, the example is Kapuatai wetland on the Haraki Plains. So in this system, the water table is high, there's native vegetation, and it's accumulating peat at about 1 millimetre a year. It's also a net greenhouse gas sink. So basically what that means is the greenhouse gas is taken up by the system and I guess stored in the organic matter, it's greater than that lost, resulting in a net greenhouse gas sink. On the right here, we have a drained peatland example. And this could be many a drained peatland under grassland in the Waikato region. So here from some work that we've done about 10 or so years ago, we know that broadly this land is probably subsiding at about 19 millimetres per year, although subsidence would have been much more rapid immediately after drainage. We also know that it's a net greenhouse gas source, so the water table is lowered, and in this system, the greenhouse gas emissions lost are greater than those taken up. So ongoing land subsidence due to peatland drainage contributes to drainage, infrastructure, and wetland management issues. Just a couple of examples. The image on the right at the top there is Moana Tuatua peatland between Te Awamutu and Cambridge. So this is surrounded by drained agricultural peatland, which is subsiding. So I guess the question is how sustainable is this wetland in the long term? On the bottom right there is some drained peatland under pasture behind Ngātea on the Haraki Plains. Due to subsidence, the land is reasonably low, and when it rains for periods of time, drainage can be an issue. Also, greenhouse gas emissions from drained peatlands contribute to Waikato region's greenhouse gas footprint. Under current management, subsidence and emissions will continue until our peatlands disappear, ongoing drainage is no longer viable, or changes to peatland management occur. So WRC, recognising these issues, has responded through policy and also more recently investigations. So in terms of peatland management policy, we really only have the Waikato Regional Policy Statement. There's a policy in there, it's called LFP 10, which requires us to manage the adverse effects of activities from the use of peat soils. There's various methods too, which directs WRC regional plans to slow the rate of subsidence and carbon loss, mitigate adverse effects from the use and development of our peat soils, and ensure drainage infrastructure minimises any adverse effects as well. There's methods which require us to promote research and advocacy into better peatland management. However, there's limited robust local information to help us implement these policies and methods. Recognizing the need for robust information, the science team applied to and received funding through subsequent LTP processes. So in the 2018 to 2028 LTP, we had a 3-year program to redevelop WRC's peat subsidence monitoring program and identify management practices within the context of current land uses that could be adopted locally to reduce both subsidence and greenhouse gas emissions. And then in the 2021 to 2031 LTP, we have a 7-year program to understand where the impacts of subsidence and greenhouse gas emissions are likely to be the greatest, identify opportunities for other land uses on our drained peatlands, develop a decision support tool for peatland management, and guidance for better peatland management as well. So we're going to talk about the work we've started, which is just above the red line, and we won't particularly touch on the work that we are yet to start. So first of all, we've redeveloped our regional scale peat subsidence monitoring network. So we did have a peat subsidence monitoring network, and the data was collected using a method called peat depth probing. However, the points in this network didn't particularly represent our drain peatlands all that well. So what we've done is we've developed a method using LiDAR, and we have 11 transects with flow and LiDAR covering 11,000 hectares of our drain peatlands. So I guess the red boxes on the image on the right there show where our LiDAR transects are. So the purpose of developing this network is to better understand the spatial variability of peat subsidence. We've also designed the transects so that they're stratified by land use, peat depth, peat type, and drainage management. The intent is that if there is a difference between these features in time, we'll hopefully pick it up in terms of peat subsidence. So we flew the first round of monitoring in April 2021, and from that, we developed a model of the land surface. We'll fly it again in 5 years' time in 2026 and develop another model of the land surface. We'll compare the 2 models of the land surface within each transect to understand what the subsidence rate is for the monitoring period over the 5 years within each transect. And hopefully we'll monitor for every 5 years after that as well, building a good data set. We've also done some work developing 11 sites to continuously monitor peat surface elevation. So we knew from other work that in natural peatlands that the peat surface oscillates throughout the seasons. And we were curious to know whether this occurred in drained peatlands as well, because this impacts on when we time our LiDAR monitoring flights for our subsidence monitoring. So we wanted to understand the seasonal peat surface oscillation across the region. Because we can calculate subsidence from these sites, we thought it would be a good opportunity to directly compare subsidence rates under different land uses. So you can see on the image on the right here, we have stars, boxes, and triangles, which represent the location of the different peat surface oscillation monitoring sites. And you'll see that they each represent dairy, dry stock, and blueberry orchards. So we have a range of different land uses. We're also using these sites to monitor water table depth because we don't have a lot of information on water table depth under our drained peatlands. So the sites have been operating since April 2021 and will continue for at least 5 years. And I want to point out that these sites are on private land, so we're incredibly lucky to have access to these sites and support from the landowners. So I just want to give you an example from data that we've collected from one site, and this is from a dairy farm between Te Awamutu and Cambridge on drained peat, of course. On the vertical axis, we have change in surface elevation, and on the horizontal axis, we have the date. So the graph shows a change in surface elevation. So from what we've seen so far across many of our sites, peat surface elevation increases in the winter-spring period, as shown by the red arrows, and then decreases in the summer-autumn period. We see that the maximum winter-spring elevation was generally lower in 2022 than 2021, of course suggesting net subsidence. Interestingly though, we've had a really wet summer, and this has meant that water tables have stayed, I guess, uncharacteristically high. And what we've seen is that surface elevation didn't decline like it did in the year previous. So perhaps this suggests the benefits of maintaining a higher water table on reducing subsidence. We've got another round of downloads from our sites coming next month, so it'll be interesting to see what ground surface elevation has done in that period. We've also done some work which has been published as a technical report to review local and international literature to understand opportunities to reduce peat subsidence and greenhouse gas emissions within the context of current land use. So we identified a mix of drainage and land management options, and they're listed in the table on the right there. I don't have time to go into them all, but implementation would likely require changes to farm systems, testing locally, and of course a feasibility assessment, although I would like to pick some key ones as part of our LTP project and test them in the field. But let's look at some examples quickly. So raising the water table as a drainage management practice and reducing cultivation as a land management practice. So in terms of drainage management and water table manipulation, water table is the overriding control and subsidence process. Deeper water tables and episodic lowering, for example, pump station upgrades, can increase subsidence and CO2 emissions. So the graph on the right here is from some international literature. And on the vertical axis, it shows average subsidence rate in centimetres a year. And along the horizontal axis is average water table depth in centimetres. So as you can see here, as the water table depth increases, the subsidence rate increases. And the difference between the sites across these different countries is likely due to climatic conditions. Normally warmer conditions result in greater rates of subsidence. So from the literature, it's recommended that we try and keep water table to minimise subsidence between 0.25 and 0.5 metres below the ground surface. Interestingly, from our peat surface oscillation sites, we see that sometimes maximum water table depth on our drain peatlands can be up to 1.5 metres deep. And there's other questions too about implementing, I guess, water table management. There's large evaporative losses during summer and also a large water source is needed. So can we feasibly and easily maintain water levels to reduce subsidence without having a summer like we've just had? This sort of work needs testing. Another is a land management example, cultivation. So cultivation increases oxidation, or I guess more simply, contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. So work by Keith Thompson in the late 70s locally suggested that cropland subsided at least twice as fast as grassland, as shown by the table on the top right there. However, we haven't seen the raw data for this work, so I guess it's hard to confirm how accurate it is. But international research also supports this. So the table on the bottom right there, we have row crops all the way down to extensive land use under trees with managed grasslands. And I guess row crops are most intensively cultivated, managed grasslands, and extensive land use under trees is least cultivated. And what we can see there is with decreasing cultivation, subsidence rate and carbon loss from those systems decreases. So it suggests that avoiding cultivation where possible would be beneficial to reducing subsidence and greenhouse gas emissions. But again, this is the sort of work that we'd like to test locally in our next phase of our LTP work. We've also just started looking at alternative land uses on our drained peatlands. So this is looking at wet land uses for the Waikato region and what possibilities there are. So far we've completed a scoping report with our colleagues at Manaki Whenua, the National Wetland Trust has been involved, and the University of Waikato. And just from that, I guess this is a start. We've observed that greenhouse gas reductions from peatland restoration is possible, but it will take time to return to a net sink. There's also a lot of work overseas around wet productive land uses. This is called polluticulture. So essentially it's farming with a high water table with the intention to reduce subsidence and greenhouse gas emissions, or perhaps stop them altogether. So some examples in Germany, I guess they have a polluticulture or wetland farming system where they're growing materials, construction materials, which they're using to build tiny homes. In the UK, they have a pilot where they're growing celery in systems with a high water table. Peat soil systems with a high water table. So there's lots of ideas and pilot studies overseas. But we need to remember that Northern Hemisphere peatland systems are different to ours, different climate, different vegetation. So again, reiterating this a lot, but we need to test this sort of stuff locally. And there's also opportunities for use of native wetland species in the Waikato, for example, raupo and harakiki. So the next step is to progress to a full report, including barriers to implementation and knowledge gaps. And if you're interested in this sort of work, there's I suggest you Google search an informative video about polluticulture by Rahil, who was a National Wetland Trust over this last summer. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Alice.
Thanks, Justin. So another peat project that we have underway at the moment is the survey or resurvey of peat depth across the region. So peat depth was last surveyed in 1976, but the raw data for this was lost. So those red points on the contour map on the right there, used to have a depth value associated with them, but these were unfortunately lost. Fortunately, the contour maps remained, and WRC was able to digitize these and estimate both the location and the depth measurement associated with those red points. However, this data is now almost 50 years out of date. And from what Justin's been talking about with subsidence rates, we're expecting these points to be a little different. So we've set about resurveying these points, and this data should give us a good idea about developing a vulnerability index and understanding where the impacts of peat subsidence are likely to be greatest. So in order to undertake this work, we have 2 field teams operating since January of this year. It's set to finish up in June. And the methodology is relatively simple, just peat depth measurements, so manually jamming a steel rod through the peat until you hit the base or the soil layer beneath. And we're also taking ground surface elevation measurements as well. So on the right there's a progress update of where we're at. All the green points are sites that we've visited so far, and any other points are sites that we are set to visit or sites that we won't be visiting. So you can see they've made some good progress with mostly green, so over 500 sites visited to date of the 670. And some preliminary results to date suggest that the maximum depth is 10.5 metres with an average depth of 2.4 metres. So on completion of the field survey, the data will be summarised in maps and within a technical report. So just to summarise the presentation, in the Waikato region, most of our peatlands are drained for pastoral agriculture. However, this causes issues such as subsidence and greenhouse gas emissions. The council has attempted to better understand peat subsidence and respond to this through policy, and the Soil and Land Science team has received funding through successive long-term plans as well. So overall, we just want to develop a better understanding of the peat resource and peat subsidence and understand what opportunities exist to reduce the subsidence and greenhouse gas emissions from peat. But we'll need some local testing, and the work is ongoing. And finally, some acknowledgements for these following working groups, and I just want to highlight the key working relationship that we have with Manaaki Whenua and the University of Waikato. And finally, acknowledgements to you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. Justin? Okay, any questions, Ben?
Yeah, actually Hayden Jones, our team leader, he does a lot of work in that space. He might be able to answer that.
Our region, excuse me, is in our region, a lot of the peat soil mapped in terms of land use classification as class 2. So it's within that class basis for.
Okay, Bruce, did you want to say something?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. You put up a lovely graph showing the subsidence rates across the world, but I couldn't see a line on it for Waikato.
No, that's a good point. I guess that was just taken directly from Buddy. But we don't have any good data on different subsidence rates under different drainage depths. But from the work that was done by the University of Waikato and Manaaki Whenua 10 years ago, Jack Pronger, as part of his BSc dissertation, we do know that the average subsidence rate under grassland, and this is based on a network that wasn't particularly well designed, they just used historical points, and a lot of those follow drains, that subsidence rate's about 19 millimetres or 2 centimetres a year, but we don't have any data on association between.
You were going to speculate on the graph that you showed us. New Zealand being a temperate climate, you could pretty well predict where the line would be, couldn't you?
Yes, I guess possibly, yes, yeah.
I think you get pretty close.
Yeah.
So, Just following on from that, is the subsidence rate linear or non-linear?
In terms of relative to drainage depth.
So, for example, you showed the earlier data from Keith Thompson.
Yep.
And then you made some comparisons. So what are the chances that the subsidence rates are faster in the initial stages of peatland development
sorry,
compared
yes.
to later in the process?
Yeah, so we know that after drainage or immediately after drainage, subsidence rates can be quite high, 10, 20 centimetres. And then as time since drainage progresses, subsidence rates typically slow, and that's been shown from both local and international data. And I guess it's not linear. It follows kind of, I guess, the easiest way to describe it is like a hockey stick, where over time the rate of subsidence slows, most rapid at the start, and then slows over time. So at the moment, we're kind of, I guess, from the data that we do have, we're down near the slowing, we're not up here, we're down here.
Council staff, in the sense that it's about closing the loop between practice and land. Actually, for Peat's sake, the document that was produced 25 years ago, developed by a group of people who were in peat management advisory, pretty well flagged every issue we've heard discussed here today. So the question is, what are the tools that would be any different, tools that developed then, encourage this land change, slow down subsidence, shift to would be considered a more sustainable approach? Just think, looking at it, you look at, I think some of this is still up on your website, Peat's sake document. Is there anything different? Hasn't already been.
So this is the importance of the policy process that you're working through now, the regional plan review process. So Justin and the rest of the science team are presenting data which is critical for your policy decision making. And so that's why it's important that Justin and the team test things locally so that when you're making your policy decisions, you're making those decisions based on a position of evidence. And so those are, the direct answer to your question is the council, its community will decide policy direction going forward based on the sort of information that Justin and others are presenting to you. So this is the critical part of that loop to get that evidential basis for your policy making going forward.
Yeah, so the basic tool that was in for Peat's sake was keep water table high, and that's exactly what we've just heard again today. 25 years ago, that was said. Last comment. So, Kormakaro, you gave some very nice data on the peat depths and the change in peat depth. I just wanted to put the biodiversity overlay on this because this is not just about the land management, the usage for farming practice. So isn't that the peat bog that still has very important patch remaining, the original vegetation? And the question is, how is that being protected or looked after in relation to the way that land is managed?
I just use that same answer. This is critical information to inform the council, which will inform your regional plan. It'll inform in future things like regional spatial plans, to be able to have those long-term decisions that you'll make through the planning process about future land use activities. Well, I guess what you're saying, Councillor, it just underpins the importance of the work that people like Justin and the team are doing to support good decision making for the council.
Yeah, so again, it's the closing of the loop, and I'm just interested in how that closing of the loop occurs, because you have essentially competing interests here. The need to reduce food, but that Kormakaro peatland is now down to the point where less than 5 hectares, I think, of the original system remains. And the other example that was shown, Moana Tuatua, 150 hectares remaining of a peat dome that was at least 2,000 hectares. And it's the question of how can the policy and practice loop be closed in a way that allows retention of some biodiversity in a system which has actually lost 77% system, 77%. Just some observations.
Absolutely. So part of, as councils will know, you put in place policy, things happen, you have policy effectiveness. And again, the science work that our team do is very much around saying how effective have things been, which then helps inform you about the next cycle of policy intervention. And so again, just myself, the criticality of the work that the team do.
Thank you.
Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou. Bruce, I guess, asked what I wanted to ask in a scientific way. All I was going to say from the layman's koutou, what are you asking us? Are you asking us to consider, to help you consider what we can do about peatlands, or so that's the first question. What exactly is your report asking us as councillors to do?
Well, I guess what it's doing is we applied for funding. Obviously the council recognises the issue because it's in policy, and we see it, you know, some of the land management issues that we face. So I guess, and we developed a program of work to try and understand how we can approach this issue. Yeah. And so I guess the purpose of the report is to update you on the work that we've been doing, make you aware, I guess perhaps for new councillors who this might be a new issue, to make them aware of the issue. And I guess, yeah, really it's for your information to let you know how we're going, what we're doing, and I guess receive any feedback as well.
Okay, so I guess a question to Brent, and that is who instigates land retirement on farms? Is it us talking to the farmer, or is the farmer saying? That's the first question, then I'll ask.
And so just to follow on from what Justin said before, one of the terms of reference of this committee is around getting information on the effectiveness of our policy interventions. And so we've got a regional policy statement, we've got regional plans, and they require certain things to happen. And what Justin and the team are doing is just showing everybody what the current state of things is, which is then helps inform whether or not the policy intent has been effective or not. I don't think Justin and the team are here to make recommendations to you one way or the other. It's presenting you with evidence. That is then information that you then feed back through the policy process for determining whether or not, if, as Councillor Clarkson is identifying, the actual state of the environment is not what science is showing was the intention of the policy, what needs to change through the policy process. And those are the conversations that you have around the playoffs, exactly what Bruce said. So again, I'm just repeating myself. This is critical information to support your decision making.
And the second one?
And so we can't, where there are actions which people wish to voluntarily undertake, obviously we work with people who might want to voluntarily do things. But if, and that often results in a whole range of beneficial outcomes because landowners want to do things which are beneficial. And so the question then becomes whether or not the council thinks that it needs to have more than a support, encouragement, education approach to more of a directive approach to achieve its policy objectives.
And the only reason I asked that question was we had a catchment tree in Vital last week, and in that korero came up about how often lands are being flooded every year. You know, just basic farmlands. And someone in that committee from Hauraki says, well, maybe they should look at retiring those lands because of the fact that they really, really are dry. And of course, there was a photo up there with a cow in that waterway, you know, which is something that PC1 did not agree to, is having stock inside water tables that are on land. And so that's why I asked the question.
Thanks. Ben?
Oh, I was just going to say that
Vertical.
something that you will advocate. And if so, what type of agriculture? Or
Yeah, so I guess the purpose of the work that we're doing right now is to try and identify whether polluticulture, based on a desktop study, whether polluticulture is potentially suitable for the Waikato peatlands, and what, for example, traditional crops might provide an opportunity in a polluticulture kind of system. So I guess I can't, at the moment, with the information I have, I can't say, you know, I recommend this or that. It's kind of, it's a work in progress. And then we hope to, the next step after that would be to perhaps identify some key opportunities for polluticulture, and then with hopefully some external funding, collaborative partners, we could test them. And I guess it's the same too, back to Bruce's question about, for Peat's sake, it was a great document, but one thing we'd really like to do is, for example, raising the water table to reduce subsidence, is to actually practically test that and see how feasible it is. Thank you.
Yep. Bruce, then Robbie.
Turn your mic on, Bruce.
Turned it off. In relation to point 24 in your report too, I like the experimental design where you're basically comparing different land uses to understand the different subsidence rates and stuff. I wondered whether you had enough places to do some within land use category comparisons. And I'm thinking in particular blueberry farming, because blueberry farming is in the Waikato is undertaken in very different ways in different blueberry farms. And example, there's at least one organic blueberry farm, and then there's some other more conventional farms. Are you going to try and tease out the differences in different management regimes within one land use category?
At the moment, that's not the intention. Well, at the moment, it's our view that we barely have enough replication to, I think we only have 3 pairs of dairy farms and blueberry orchards. So essentially for other councils, what we have is we have a dairy farm, and then right next door, we have a blueberry orchard, and we're monitoring each for subsidence. So at the moment, our intention was just to, I guess, compare the fundamental land uses, but I guess we'll see how it goes in terms of drilling down deeper into different management practices on each of those.
Robbie?
Thank you. I've been actually bringing this up for quite a while now, and most of us sitting here around the table here are actually members of ICM as well. So I seriously, I think we should be talking about not land drainage, but water management. If we change our way that we manage water instead of draining water, that will give these farmers tools to start doing their own thing of holding up water on there. But at the moment, they legally aren't allowed to. Legally, they have to drain it. They can't actually hold water up. If they block the water from someone else flooding on someone else's property, they're in the. So I think that's where some of this discussion needs to go back to ICM and where you're going towards, Bruce.
We'll have a chat later, but I mean, I don't entirely agree with what's just been said, because there are some ways that can retain water table without necessarily compromising your neighbour, and I can think of real examples where this happens. So we'll take that offline.
Great. Yep. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Okay. Right, Justin, Alice, are you completed? Yep. Great. Thanks for your presentation. And can we have a mover, please, to receive the report? Bruce, thank you. And Ben seconding. All in favour? Opposed? Carried. Thanks very much. Look, are you all in favour of a 10-minute recess? Okay, good. We'll do that back at, let's make it, 11:40. All right. Thanks.